The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome everyone to the Agilista PM webinar. It's a super special treat to have Alan Shalloway here with us today. He's going to talk about the different Agile approaches, XP, Scrum, Lean, Kanban, and probably a lot of other things for you. I want to tell you a little bit about Alan. Alan is definitely one of the biggest thought leaders in Agile and the Lean space, so he's going to have a lot of great things to share with you today. He's the founder and CEO of Net Objectives. I'll let Alan tell you a little bit about what they do himself. And you know, he's got 40 years experience in doing development. He's MIT grad with expertise in helping organizations build that software to achieve business agility. He really helps organizations transition into that lean agile world, especially, and this is the key word, at the enterprise-wide level. And I'll let him talk about that a little bit more as well. But you know, Alan teaches, he coaches, he speaks at seminars and trade shows, user groups. He just spoke at something last night we were chatting about earlier. And he's an author of books. He'll go into this stuff a little more detail. But Alan, thank you for coming and spending some time with us today.
Well, thank you, Donna. I'm glad to be here, and I'm really glad to be talking to a lot of people in the PMI. I wanted to take a minute or two adding a couple of background things because it's important, I think, to understand kind of the history. I like to tell people the fact that I've been in the industry for 40 years doesn't mean I'm smarter than anybody else. It just means I've probably seen more than a lot of people, and sometimes that perspective is actually useful. And in Net Objectives, we end up working with enterprises. When I started Net Objectives, actually, it was more about technical training. And it wasn't long to really discover that, the developers have the code, or the testers do, so when things go wrong or are late, we tend to kind of blame them. Oh, they got it last, it must be their fault. But in practice, it's usually not the team itself that's causing the problem, it's other things. So we've kind of expanded our offerings because of this. And we look at this entire perspective. Now, this slide is just here really for your future reference, and it'll be at the end. And when you get access online, the netobjectives.com resources page has huge amounts, literally days of information available online for people. And these are some of the books I've written. You can see the design patterns explained. So my background is technical. I can talk to people about how you do this agilely, but that's not what this talk's going to be about. The book on the right hasn't been published yet. It's almost ready to go, and that's also essential skills book for developers. But these middle two show some of the range of Lean Agile. A lot of this, that was basically a compendium of a lot of the work we've done. And if you guys are doing Scrum and you like what I talk about today, and the pocket guide for Scrum teams is basically our approach in doing Scrum. Anyway, on to the talk. Oh, and by the way, I'm not sure if Donna mentioned this, but if you have questions as we go, just put them in the question box. The way we work is she's going to answer those she can, and then she'll mark those that I need to stop at different times to answer. So throughout the process, please ask questions. I'm hoping we'll have a few minutes at the very end to just deal with questions as well. So this is basically the agenda. It's kind of a high level. I'm actually covering quite a lot of things, so I can't go too deeply in any of them. But I'm going to talk about just the general idea of why we're doing Agile, and I'll talk a little bit about Scrum, XP, Kanban, Scrumban, and Lean, and what are some of the factors that you have to take a look at. And it's funny, sometimes we talk about selecting the right process, but sometimes I'm going to suggest maybe that isn't even the right question, and at the end we'll have some Q&A, as we'll have throughout the thing. So just as a little level set on why Agile, and if you like more information here, this is a good place to go to our resources. Under the business management section, we have a webinar called The Business Case for Agility, where we go into this in really gory detail, or beautiful detail, I guess I should say. But it's the idea Agile really makes the most sense when you think about it as business agility, the ability for the business to identify, define, prioritize those projects, those enhancements that will make the most business value to the business, and then do that in a quick way where we focus on that thing that has the highest value so we can respond quickly. So we don't want necessarily a year project or a year plan in great detail where nothing gets delivered for a year, because then we can't, if new ideas come up, we can't interject those. So we want to be able to respond by giving value to customers quickly to change the business needs, new opportunities we see, new responses to our competition, and that's the case for business agility adding value. But this has some side effects which are good. We get feedback from our customers, so we can see, are we building the right thing? We also get a better status of our projects. If it's like 6 months before a project is out and you've gone through the normal approach of like a 6-month plan and then analysis, design, code, test, and you have maybe these milestones, you might actually be getting through design well, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're through as far as you think. I think we've all seen projects like 10 months into the project, like on a 10-month project, maybe 6 months into it, we're 6 months on schedule, and the 7th month we seem to be 2 months behind. And that's actually not possible if you have source control, because if you were on schedule at 6 months and you find yourself 2 months behind, just reset to where you were 6 months, you'll be 1 month behind. But of course you really weren't on schedule at 6 months, you just didn't know it. So when you deliver Agile, whether you're actually releasing it or just building it, see, Agile has you, even if you can't release it for a few months, you at least build it where you can see where you are. So every few weeks you actually see where you are and you get feedback from customers, if you select ones to give you feedback about how you're doing, and you can basically see where the project is because you're basing the rate of completion based on actual working code. This also shortens delays between when you make a mistake and discover you made a mistake, and shortening these delays actually avoids creating a lot of extra work. You've all seen how if a developer writes a bug and you tell him about it immediately, he's a lot faster to get it fixed than if you tell him about it a month later. Part of that is a reset in their mind, but part of it is things have changed. It's more complex, so they don't remember what they did because they've been doing so many things. So as things delay your work, as it takes longer to go from start to finish, you actually create more work to do. And this is also by doing it in stages, even though it takes a new skill set that some people don't have and they need to learn, there is a way of developing in stages that actually is faster. This is actually, we talk about this in the Essential Skills book and the Design Patterns book. And we're not going to talk about it much here, but if you have people who are interested in that, you can also send me an email if you can't find it on our website. So anyway, when you look at Agile, there are some things that they have in common, but Agile is not this uniform community anymore. I'm not really sure 10 years ago it was that uniform, but it was more uniform. It seemed that Agile was working more at the team level. But the two things now that I would say are in common is there is this focus on incremental delivery of work and a respect for the people doing the work. And when I say respect for the people doing the work, I'm not saying other methods aren't respectful. So maybe that's a bad way to say it, but what I really mean is that the people doing the work get to define how they do the work. This is sometimes called self-organizing teams. Some people call this self-managing teams, which I personally don't agree with. I think teams need some level of management, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I go. In fact, when you look at the variation in the Agile community, I was just trying to think of like the top ones, and these 8 came to mind. I'm sure there are more. But the role of management varies a lot between the methods. The perspective, am I focused on the team or the organization, is quite considerably different. How explicit do I make the process? There's a lot of disparity in if that's possible. We talk about Agile as time boxing, building in small steps, but time boxing means I'm going to commit to building a certain amount in a certain amount of time. Not all Agile methods require that. That was kind of there at the beginning, and Scrum is defined that way, but some others aren't. What's the thought about technical practices? Do we go bottom up or top down in our transition to it? And do we take a systemic or a people approach in learning about how to solve problems? And finally, what is the needed abruptness of the transition? In other words, can I smoothly go from non-Agile to Agile, or is it a big shake-up? And we'll see where that fits. Now, I see a question, where does RUP fit in? That kind of depends. Now, I'd have to say that sooner or later, right? I am a consultant. But what I mean it depends on is RUP is something in and of itself can be very varied. If you look at RUP as it's commonly done, if you ask me, RUP is more of a upfront planning type thing and can be a heavy architecture or a heavy process. But the way it was intended is actually to be a fairly elaborate, where you're elaborating, iterating through and building in stages. So RUP can be Agile. I'm not going to be talking about RUP because typically it hasn't been a big Agile method, but that's not because it can't be. It's just because it just is often, my experience has been anyway, again, just from what I've seen, is it seems to go in more in places that are a little more heavy process. But that is not how it has to be. There's some really good books about the unified process that talk about it being a very much lightweight process, actually. So let's start with Scrum, since it's really the most agile team process right now, and it's about building software in iterations. It started out as like 4-week iterations. Actually, they used to say 30-day, but people discovered relatively quickly that, well, that means then you start on different days of the week. So most people who like longer ones do 4 weeks. What this means is at the start of your sprint, as it's called, you'll decide what you're going to do. You'll then do that over the next 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks, whatever it is you decided on, and get it delivered. The idea of Scrum is actually to keep the team protected from interruptions, and the way interruptions are often interpreted is management, which isn't actually accurate. But there's kind of this, I always like to keep in mind the de jure definition and the de facto definition, and the de jure definition is it really is just interruptions. But most people, when they do Scrum, they kind of think about it as how do we isolate the team so they can get their job done and keep management off our backs. And it just shows up that way a lot of the time. That's not really part of the definition. It kind of depends on who you get your training from. It is about self-organizing teams, and this means that the teams get together, they figure out how they're going to get their work done. Now, a little illustration of what this looks like is I'm going to have somebody called the product owner. That's the role. There are 3 main roles in Scrum. One is the product owner. She decides on what are those features we're going to sometimes also these are listed as stories, are important to get done, and they're prioritized. They're not ABC priority, but they're like, this is the first one, this is the next one, this is the third one. And we have this product backlog, we could say. It's typically at a product level. These are all the features that are needed for the product. And then what happens is they're given to the team, and the team commits to a certain number of these stories. Again, let's say we have a 2-week iteration. That's usually what most people recommend these days. But there is not a right answer here. They commit to, oh, we can get this amount of work done in 2 weeks. So they go work on this, and then they validate it with the customer, and then they have it ready to be delivered. Now, if there's not enough stuff there to be worth the delivery of it, either in terms of functionality or because of the high cost of delivery, you won't deliver it. You'll just hold it. You'll show it to somebody, and you'll just show it to somebody and keep going through this process. So every 2 weeks you build some things and you get more and more things you can deliver. And at some point you will actually release it when you have enough stuff and it's worth value to the customers, but also worth the delivery cost. So that's basically Scrum. It's this every 2 weeks the team's figuring it out. The product owner is one role, explaining what's of value. The Scrum Master is kind of like a facilitator. You can call them an agile, well, I would call them an agile coach, but again, a lot of people believe they're more of a facilitator for things. And then the team is really the third role. So what I want to do is as we go through things here, is take a look at these things that I said were kind of varied. So I'm going to be comparing the methods. And basically, these were those 8 things I mentioned where there was a lot of variation. I'm going to be compiling a table that there's this role of management. Basically, in Scrum, there is not much of a role of management. The team gets to figure out how to do things. They have the Scrum Master facilitating them. The perspective is based on the team. There's not really an explicit process. I mean, the team figures out how they do it, and they just do it. They talk amongst themselves. Some people in the Scrum community actually feel it's not possible to even have an explicit process. That's kind of, they're a split camp on that, but Scrum in and of itself doesn't talk about it directly. Time boxing, yes, this is what I mentioned, every 1, 2, 4 weeks, things like that. Technical practices are ignored. That doesn't mean they don't think they're important. It just means it's not part of Scrum. It's something you have to add to it. It's a bottom-up approach. You come from the team. If you have to go beyond teams, then you do this thing called Scrum of Scrums where they come and work together, but it's a team-to-team-to-team building up. You focus on people skills, and the transition method is often abrupt. Probably should say often abrupt. It's not always abrupt. But what this means is you need to have formulated teams. Well, some companies don't have well-defined teams, so you've got to create them. You've got to make them able to focus on one thing. So when So I'm going to stop for a second and answer some of the questions. So there are not standards really for Agile similar to the PMBOK. There are some groups that are saying these are things you need to be doing, and I'll show this a little bit more. But it's not like in the way PMI has done it. Not saying that there's this question about the role of management. It's something that's somewhat ignored, and this is actually, I think, one of the reasons Scrum has worked very well at a team level and has not as stellar a track record when you try to go beyond a team or a couple of teams. Okay, where do business requirements fit in when using Agile? Well, see, Agile is going to be a lot of different methods, so I'm going to just talk about where it fits in with Scrum. Where it fits in with Scrum is a product owner, it might be a product manager, something like that, decides these are the important things. That's, of course, not all there is in business requirements, and we'll get to that. And in my mind, this is what would be one of the defining differences between what I'd call the first generation and second generation of things. So when we say in Scrum, bottom up is secured by the top-down product log or functional WBS, actually, that's correct, or should be. It sometimes isn't. Sometimes Scrum people do just come from the stories, but it should be done by the WBS. But when I mean top-down, bottom-up, I don't mean just in the requirements. I mean actually in the organization. How do you do the transition? And it's typically with Scrum, you start with the teams. It's a team-focused thing. The other thing is you could say maybe in the requirements it's a top-down, but it's always a top-down for a product. And if you're in a large organization where you got 30 products, starting at the top of a product, in my mind, is a bottom-up approach, because how do you organize all those products together? So we'll talk a little bit about that. Problem is I've really got just an hour, so some of these are great questions, and we'll have other resources, things. So anyway, there's a question here, and I'm going to the next one, so it's perfect. Isn't XP the de facto technical practices in Scrum? And the answer is actually no. But parts of XP are. So in the last couple of years, the Scrum community has started absorbing some of the XP practices that are mentioned here. Like XP is known for paired programming. Most Scrum people don't do paired programming, so that's why I'd say XP is not the de facto standard. Most Scrum people do agree continuous integration is good. Test-driven development is kind of a mixed bag in Scrum. Test-driven development means I'm writing my tests at the unit level before I write the code. There's also this notion of acceptance test-driven development, which means I'm writing my acceptance test first. If you take like a certified Scrum Master course or an implementing Scrum, you usually don't hear much about test-driven development or acceptance test-driven development. So there are many Scrum trainers who believe in this, but they haven't really absorbed these yet. And this is a good transition that more and more are getting to start this, but it definitely is not a de facto practice. So that's why I say it's not really Scrum with technical practices either, because there's this different mindset about kind of a really, in XP, what you're trying to do is you really have closer contact with the customers if possible. They're not quite the same, but Scrum has absorbed many, many XP practices. The biggest difference really is that XP really talks about these practices as essential. It's not part of the Scrum mantra that you have them, although after years of ignoring it somewhat, the Scrum teams have recognized, well, we better have them. So Scrum is adopted to some level. What's kind of ironic, in '95 when it was formed by Jeff Sutherland, he actually had a lot of test-driven development, XP engineering practices in there. But then when Scrum started being kind of promoted, that was dropped by Ken Schwaber, who's really been the big evangelist. And part of that was because it was just easier to get people started with Scrum without them. And part of it was because the idea is, well, teams are smart if they need to put it in. But for all practical reasons, XP practices were not present in Scrum until like the last 3 or 4 years at a common level. And they are getting more and more common. Okay. How do requirements gathering differ among the different methods? That'll kind of get a little clearer. It has to do with the perspective again. Scrum doesn't talk about it directly except at the product level. I'm not going to be able to go into this in much detail, but on our website under resources, there's a reference to our Lean-Agile software development book. There's several chapters online. You could go there, and there's a lot of information about that there. How how does architecture fit in with Scrum and other Agile methods? It's kind of ignored. But again, you could go to our website. There's some blogs on it. We're very big. We're keen on architecture. We don't want to over-architect, but you do need to pay attention to this. Okay. Okay. So again, some of these other questions, like whether there's a sprint zero or not, I'm just going to have to refer to our website. That's a question of sprint zero is the notion before I start, how much setup do I do? Again, not part of Scrum. More people are recognizing this is necessary. We used to do lots and lots of Scrum. At one time, actually, Net Objectives was one of the bigger Scrum trainers, and we always thought that was necessary to have some kind of setup, you might say. Okay, so I'm going to move on. These are good questions. And there are also other ways, if I don't get to questions, we'll be able to answer them later on user groups and things of that nature. So let's look at what Kanban is. Now, Kanban still starts with a list of prioritized features. Typically, the list is a little smaller. But what you do is it basically comes into the team, and you base it on this notion of flow. You actually are trying to lay it out where I'm not actually predicting I can get this done in 2 weeks or 4 weeks. You just work on it, and you focus on working on one thing. You manage your work in progress so you can go faster. So one thing comes in and it goes out. Another thing comes in and it goes out. Another thing comes in and it goes out. And again, you might build these in stages. You can create a cadence, like every 2 weeks I'll see where I've done. But I'm not committed to the 2 weeks like I was before. I'm just going as fast as I can by focusing. The mantra is sometimes stop starting and start finishing. How do I work on one thing so I'm more efficient, more effective? I'm lowering basically the cycle time from the start to the end. And when it's releasable, I deliver it, and I have cadence on input and output just so I can manage it a little better. But the idea is it looks a little bit like this, or can look a little bit like this. This would be what would be called a Kanban board. And what I have is, on the left, the product managers would manage these things called minimal viable features. This is like the smallest thing of value to business that's viable to release. And I might start like with just some of them listed, and I might refine them. The yellow stickies are meant to be like stories for them. And then it goes into the development team's Kanban board where it's ready for development. Notice the queue in some of these columns. This means that that's a queue. These are waiting. Those are ones ready for development. Then I might have one in analysis. I might have something ready for design. Then that gets to design. So you can imagine that what's happening here is I've got this flow from analysis, design, coding, and testing. I've got this flow where I'm either working on it or it's waiting to be worked on. And the way Kanban works is it actually says I need to manage how many different items I'm working on at any one time. Because let's say I didn't do this. Like I've got 5 things for coding there. I've got 2 waiting and 3 working on. And if I have 4 or 5 people, or 3 people anyway, that's probably good. You know, I got 3 things people and 3 people working on it. But what would happen if I could analyze and design a lot faster than I can code? Then what we'd start seeing is there'd start being this queue, a lot of things waiting at ready for code. Well, instead of just finding other things for people to do, Kanban would suggest that you look to see why am I getting, actually limit how many things I could give to the coding people. So the designers, the analysts, whatever, they have to actually either help prepare for faster coding, or maybe I have some people who could be coding but they're doing design or analysis. How do I work on my bottleneck? In other words, I'm looking at the theory of constraints. What's constraining me? I want to move something from left to right on the board as quickly as I can because I know if I do that I won't create work caused by delays. So I'm looking at flow as opposed to just getting work done. Now, I'm just going to anticipate a couple of questions. I'm just going to anticipate a couple of questions in the sense that this kind of looks waterfallish, except two points. First of all, I just drove it out the way a new team might start where they've already done this. And you don't need to do it this way. You can have any order you want. And in practice, I might have something like, instead of ready for code, I'd have defined my tests before that. So I could make it more of a test-driven, which is what we always recommend. Also, even if it was this pure way of doing it like this, it's not really waterfall. Waterfall is not that defined by do analysis, design, code, and test. In practice, you always do analysis, design, code, and test. Even if you're doing upfront testing, you're using your tests as a kind of analysis. You're answering the question, how will I know I've done that, in a sense, with your tests. The thing is a matter of scale. See, in Kanban, you're talking about getting a story done the same way with Scrum. I get a story and it's small. It's a few days of work. In Waterfall, you're planning out the entire thing. you're planning out the you're doing your analysis for the entire project. You're doing your design for the entire project. In Agile methods, you're kind of designing a sliver of the functionality, and you're learning off that. Okay. So I'm just doing a quick check for questions. Some of the questions is, how do you track progress with Kanban? Well, there are two ways you can do it. The standard way is you just see how long things take from left to right. In other words, start to finish. That's called cycle time, and you want to lower your cycle time. You can also look at what's called a cumulative flow diagram, where you see how many things you have in each of the different steps, where you want it to be smooth. I use the term flow. Imagine it's like water flowing. If I get a bottleneck and a large number of things in one place, that'll show up as a lot of work in progress. And there's nothing that says you can't actually see how much work is being accomplished and coded in the same way Scrum does, although that's often not done. We've done it at times, though, ourselves. So if I look at Kanban compared to Scrum and XP, you'll see when I talked about variation, we're going to see that every row is different, basically. They think management is critical. Management is not micromanaging, however. Management is actually helping the development team to enable flow and is there to actually make sure that the team and different teams can work together well. The perspective is one of an organizational view. By this, I mean it's not when did it get to the team and then get out, but actually how are you getting your business requirements. Kanban doesn't talk too much about the product management, so maybe at the organization, that's maybe more true when I'm at the lean level, which is more of a complete organizational view, but Kanban provides greater visibility to management in business and what's happening. Kanban suggests an explicit process, as you saw in that storyboard or the Kanban board. I do this step, I do this step, I do this step, and we'll see why this is really important in just a couple more minutes. There is no time boxing in Kanban. You basically, something goes in and you get it done and go out. It's both a bottom-up and a top-down in implementation. In other words, you're including management in it, but you're also having the teams figure out how to do their work. So you have management provide business and management provide a vision with teams implementing it. It's very systemic in its approach, and by that I mean when something goes wrong, you don't focus on the people, rather you focus on the system the people are in. You ask, like, how can we improve the system so people can get their job done better? But it's the people who have to figure out how to do this. So it's not a micromanagement approach at all. But it's acknowledging that most errors are due to the way things are set up. For example, if you have difficulty talking to customers because they're just not available, what you'll find is that causes a lot of problems in understanding requirements. So we have to be careful about that. Okay. Kanban does not directly talk about architecture, does not directly talk about architecture, as in a lot of ways XP does to some level, because XP talks about emergent design and in some sense your architectures will unfold and gives you some methods to it. Kanban and Scrum recognize this, but they don't really tell you how to do it. You know, I get this question a lot too. Scrum and XP, are they comparing apples and oranges or oranges and grapefruit? And, well, see, to me, the question is, what are you using a process for? To me, it's how do you create team agility? So, I think you have to ask, what is the intention? But if you're trying to get different team agility, then it's more a question of scope and what do you need. And I personally believe, I'll talk more about the different levels that are needed. So let's just do a quick review of Scrumban. I'm going to go then into a little bit different detail, and I'm going to talk about why these differences are very important. Scrumban is really very much like Kanban, except you add iterations to it. So think about Scrum. In fact, Scrumban was invented by Corey Lattice to help teams transition from Scrum to Kanban. So let's think about it. I got these iterations. But the problem is there's no real explicit flow. There's really no science underneath it. By science underneath it, I mean Kanban or Lean actually suggests that there are ways you have to, there are kind of rules of doing product development that if you ignore will be problematic. Scrum really doesn't really address this. And again, this is one of those things that some people believe you can't even do. They say, oh, this is complex adaptive systems where we are, that we're working on in chaos theory and complexity, and there's no predictability. And the truth is there's not very good predictability or even much predictability directly, but you can use feedback to control the process. Like driving your car is not very predictable. You can't drive straight and not adjust, but you can adjust continuously to keep it under control. So that's an important thing. So the difference between Scrumban and Kanban is mostly whether you have iterations or not, but otherwise it's the same mindset. And actually, I realize it'd be good to give you a little background. Why do we call it Kanban? And those of you who are familiar with lean manufacturing, unfortunately, you're going to be misled because of that. Because Kanban was used as the token that's used in manufacturing to say I'm ready for some other task. But it was really meant to be a virtual Kanban. It was really meant to be the idea of limiting your work in progress. And what do I mean by limiting work in progress with like a card? And there's a quick story I can say. When I was in Tokyo a few years ago, we walked into the Imperial Gardens, and it was a really nice day. It was kind of during the week, so there weren't that many people about. And my wife and I walked in, and this elderly gentleman gave us each a white card, and on the card it just said, on one side in English, please return to attendance, and the other side, I assume it said the same thing in Japanese. And basically, that's it. He just handed it to me, didn't ask us for any money, didn't say anything else. I mean, just nodded, smiled. And then what was the purpose of the card? And the purpose of the card actually turns out to be at the different entrances and exits, they have a certain number of these cards. So, if you had 1,000 cards, if you didn't have one to get in, you wouldn't get in. I mean, and so it's a very easy way of tracking, not so much how many are in the park, because you'd have to count them all the time, but rather limiting the number of people that were in the park. Like if they didn't want more than 1,000, this would be easy to do. Just have 1,000 cards there, and more or less they would work reasonably well. I mean, sometimes somebody might forget to give a card back, and sometimes people might come from one side more than the other, or leave on one side something different from what they come in. But more or less it's an easy way to control things. And that's the idea of Kanban. You're controlling the amount of work in progress, because if you work on too many things, you ever had an analyst who's working on helping 5 different teams and then they're always waiting for them, and then the information they get is old. See, this is causing problems. Kanban is suggesting we manage the flow so we don't have these kind of backups. Okay, ATDD means acceptance test-driven development. It basically means that before you write code, you will get an acceptance test defined anyway, answering the question, how will I know I've done this? This has great and good ramifications. It basically means it keeps the testers and the developers kind of in sequence with each other, and it helps in the communications when developers understand what they need. If you're more interested in this, if you go again the resource section under we call it Agile, Team Agility under resources, we have both a webinar and a chapter from our book available to listen. It's called The Role of QA in Lean-Agile Methods, or some similar name to that. Okay. A lot of these others are good questions, but I don't have time in an hour, so I'll talk about at the end where you can just ask questions on user groups. Yeah, the interaction between the customer and the team is still pretty much the same in all these methods, although, to be honest, I think Scrum's model of a product owner where you talk to them mostly is not as good as the generic Lean or Kanban model of like a product champion leading the team to understand. I kind of like that metaphor better. Okay, this is another interesting thing about Kanban, is I can have different teams actually have a shared board. So I can see, support project XYZ. I can see across all these teams what's going on. I can see, how many resources or people I have for this. And in fact, if I have to share people or resources, I can actually make a common board like this and then manage the work in progress on that. So there's some immediate scalability with Kanban, whereas Scrum and XP, you're more or less limited to 8 to 10, maybe 12 people. Kanban coordinated teams of 40 to 50 people, is not too hard to start out because they're each working on their flow. You're just managing your work in progress. Now, this is really one of the key things. I keep mentioning this flow, so I want to just reemphasize this here, that we want to eliminate delays to improve quality and cost. If you're working on one thing, you'll get that started and done faster than if you're working at 3 things. And if you're working on 3 things, then these times from getting information and using it or making an error until detecting it or needing information until getting it, if the more things you're working on at once, the more you'll have a challenge, and the more new work will be created. We call this kind of induced work. So Kanban gives you an explicit method to manage this. Scrum is also trying to lower these, as is XP, but they don't really give you an explicit method. They just say, oh, people are smart, figure it out. I really would rather understand the rules of the game, so to speak, and how do I manage my work, what do I know how to look for. So that's an important thing. Now, I do say lean. I've been saying lean Kanban, and they aren't the same thing, but they are very highly related. So lean is kind of a higher view of that you're taking a systemic approach. You're following really a lot of what Deming said in the 50s. Deming was a gentleman who went out to Japan. He's one of the people who was acknowledged for turning Japanese production around. And his approach was basically most errors are from the system, take a systemic approach, but you've got to respect your people. They're the ones who have to see how to improve the system. Toyota added this notion of doing things just in time, that if you did things too early or too late, you would cause waste. And he also had this notion of what he called automation, meaning automation with a human touch. So he was trying to get the normal stuff running fast, and if something went wrong, you'd then jump in, see what went wrong, see why it went wrong, and fix it, and then go back to normal operation. So lean is this bigger picture and includes the entire enterprise. Kanban is an implementation of lean thinking at the team level, totally consistent with lean thinking. So you can think of lean as the big picture, a set of philosophies, set of principles, general practices throughout an organization. Kanban is a particular way of manifesting those at a team. So when I say lean Kanban, I really mean kind of the lean perspective, and Kanban's my implementation. Okay. As far as more information on lean, I really think at this point the best books for that are our own software book, Lean-Agile Software Development, Achieving Enterprise Agility. The Poppendix books are great, and also Don Reinertson's Managing the Design Factory are really the good books. Okay. So let's look at what happens, because to be honest, all this theory and here's what things say, I don't really care about. What happens? What happens out in the field? One of the interesting things of my job is I get to see dozens of companies in a year, either ones I'm working with directly or ones that other people in my company are working for. And one of the things I see as an anti-pattern in Scrum that Kanban or Scrumban avoids is that in Scrum, the teams typically end up starting with too many stories. They eventually learn their lesson, but there's nothing guiding them other than, find what your impediments are and fix them. So for several iterations, this is kind of an epidemic problem of you have QA behind the developer team. Also, sometimes there's a lot of effort and estimation that's really not adding a lot of value. And part of it is because certain techniques like planning poker got really popular, and people aren't always reinvestigating them. There's a better method called team estimation by Steve Bachman that actually is better. At least in my mind, it's better because it avoids this problem of spending too much time. Kanban and Scrumban avoids these by paying attention to flow, which actually gives you clues as to how to solve the problems. And I think that's important. But the big thing for me was something that happened a year ago. And those of you who are interested, I'm going to really highly suggest the Lean Software and Systems Consortium in Atlanta in April 21st to 23rd. It'll be even better than our conference last year in May. It's a fairly small conference. We have 200-300 people. But what was noticed there when people were giving experience reports is that there was a much higher rate of continuous learning, continuous process improvement. That's what CPI means, continuous process improvement, or you could say continual learning. It was demonstrated that if for some reason, Kanban teams seem to learn faster than Scrum teams. And we talked about this a lot, and some of it was there was less focus on the process. There was rather focus on the process, less focus on the people, so people weren't kind of afraid. Even if people aren't fearful, they often identify with their work. Developers very much often think what their work is has something to do with their value. I don't mean value like monetarily, but their intrinsic value. A lot of left-brain engineering types think that. I know I do. I mean, I've had to outgrow that. It's just a tendency we get for whatever reason. But the real value is because you have this board and you have this explicit process, you get to discuss each other's kind of implicit rules. So what people are doing kind of gets discussed and talked about out in the open, and you learn faster because of that. People can think in terms of these concrete rules, but you start learning the rules, and that's one thing there. So this is actually something that's kind of interesting. So actually, I see this comment, and I gotta say something about this. Kanban may not necessarily emphasize on quality, but does on speed. Actually, when you do Lean properly and do Kanban properly, the focus on speed from start to end will improve quality, because you'll see that those things that slow you down actually add to cost and lower quality. And I'll just briefly mention on Toyota, because actually I don't normally consider myself prescient, but at this Miami Kanban conference, one of my talks, I gave 2 talks here, one of my talks was actually talking about Lean as divorced from Toyota. See, I don't think of Lean as coming from Toyota. Don Reinerson doesn't think of Lean as coming from Toyota. That's where the name was. And Toyota definitely kind of formulated it. But the notion of paying attention to product development flow, respecting people, the new opportunities for management, these are all things that do not have to be Toyota's the definitive thing. And what's ironic is about a year and a half ago, I started thinking, I don't really like putting all this thing in Toyota, because first of all, even then I was having some nervousness, because Lean is actually about adding value to the customers. A few years ago, Toyota decided they wanted to be the largest automaker, and they stopped their vision of adding value to their customers, and they started going after market share. So in an ironic way, what's happened to Toyota is a demonstration of what happens when you stray from Lean principles, even when you're the company that has defined a lot of what those principles are. So it actually, to me, is an illustration of the power of focusing on value and not focusing on market share. And actually, Toyota, the quality in terms of car building, in terms of process manufacturing, again, it wasn't because they followed Kanban. Okay, so anyway, there's one comment here. It sounds to me you don't agree with Scrum and are touting Kanban and Scrumban. And the answer is actually, yeah, I'd actually say that. I mean, years ago we used to do a lot of Scrum training, and at teams it worked fine, and when you started going to the organization, it started working less fine. And I'm going to talk about that in just another slide. PDSA is plan, do, study, act. What this means is I'll plan, I'll look at my Kanban board, I'll see what I'm saying I'm going to have happen, how much work in progress I should have. I can do it, and then I can study it, see, well, gee, we said we could have 5 things here, but it's overwhelming us, we really should have 4. Or we said we could have 5, and guess what? Behind us there's not enough work. Let's bump the limit up a little bit. So I can do this kind of continuous learning with things. So my question is, then we talk about which process to use. Maybe that's really not even the right question. Why do I say this? Because if we look at the whole going from visioning to getting something out, we really, Lean will cover this whole thing. Agile typically talks only about the development and deployment. Well, what about all that stuff up front, that timing up front? So there's this, if a customer asks for something and you wait a year and a half before you give it to them, before you even start, and then you get it in 6 months, that's not a 6-month delivery cycle. That's a 2-year delivery cycle. So we want to include, how do we do product approval and product staffing basically before we do our products? And Scrum doesn't deal with this issue. And if you look at what I'll call the value stream, from like where I go from the customer input on the upper right to the business prioritizing, selecting and defining things, those are like the products that are going to be done on the bottom left, and then the team's building it. The question is, how do I get this whole thing flowing around? So I get customers basically going to the business, to the development team and all this. Management's role is to make this thing flow. And this is actually one of the things I think you have to attend to. You have to look at this entire enterprise, and this is what we mean by the Lean enterprise. The Lean enterprise would be business defining value, the team's making it, and management ensuring its flow. We kind of call this make value flow. The make is, this is where Scrum, XP, Kanban all kind of center on. Kanban does it a little bit differently. Scrumban does it, more like what Scrum would with iterations, but the biggest difference is at the team level, you create a lot of visibility in Kanban and Scrumban so management can see what's happening, so you can help them influence the whole process. Value is prioritization of the business. how do I do this across product lines? Well, this is actually something that more or less all of these, to some level, ignore. Scrum and XP mostly. Kanban actually doesn't quite deal with it directly. Lean would in what we call product portfolio management. Lean principles would tell you how to spend some time in selecting these. What's nice is if you have an understanding of product development flow, then you understand that if I dump too many things on the development team, it's going to slow them down too much, and therefore there's an influence, at least, that Kanban allows on product managers, and it seems to be helpful. What I find interesting is, although Scrum and XP tend to ignore management, you'll notice they're the ones that have two things in this approach of Lean. You've got to be able to create visualization of what's happening. How do you impact impediments? How do you improve that? Think of workflow as a process of the different steps. And I've got to be accountable. This doesn't mean control. See, visual control is has a special meaning. It doesn't mean I'm controlling the teams. It means the teams are working in a way that I can see using visual boards or tools that I can see around, that I can see what's happening, and therefore management can provide assistance and coaching and improve the process. So management's responsible for flow and accountability to the whole thing. So if we look at this board again, Scrum tends to work here, products and product owners. XP tends to work here, the teams rather, and the customers, but Lean is really about the whole thing. And I should say this is in practice, because there are people who are trying to extend the role of XP or Scrum. There are definitely Agilists out there who I would not say are necessarily Lean thinkers, but take Agile and the whole thing. But it's not part of the XP or Scrum process, and in Lean it absolutely is. Okay, I'm getting kind of close to the end, but I wanted to mention a couple things here. And I'm going to review. Let me just quickly look through. Okay, I'm going to answer one question here, and then I'm going to try to do these slides. We'll still have a few more minutes. So, like, what's your experience with Kanban and globally distributed teams? I would say bad, but not as bad as with Scrum. And why do I mean that? When you have globally distributed teams, your work is just tough. It is much harder. If you can get people to be co-located and you do exactly what you're doing now, your productivity levels will go up at least 3 times. We've seen this. I've looked at when we do assessments for organizations to see where they are. We've sometimes seen some teams that were more or less exactly the same in terms of product knowledge, domain knowledge, type of product, skill, motivation, but those that were co-located had at least a 3-to-1, even though they were doing the same process. The reason I say Kanban's a little better is not because it solves these problems directly, but it gives you at least a mantra, a mindset on how to solve the problems, which is pay attention to speed and delay. So obviously when you're distributed, you're going to have more of that, but you start paying attention to like flow of communication. It just gives you a better mindset to solve a tough problem. By the way, one thing I would suggest, if you are globally distributed, do something we call nearshoring. Personally, I'm all against offshoring of any kind, just because it's not of any kind. That's not quite right. If you could have offshore teams that do it all, that's no problem. But if you're, or it's at least not as bad a problem, because you still got to talk to your product owners. But if you're having stories going back and forth, it's alleviated a little bit if you have them in the same time zone that you're in or not too far away. So that's why some people have set up offshoring sites in like Mexico and Argentina, places like that, because then you're just a few hours away, not the 11.5 hours to India or I guess 11 hours to China or something. Here's one of the bigger differences I want to talk about the Lean paradigm, though, that there are really some industrial paradigms that we've lived with. So ways back, basically what you had was craftsmanship. I'm talking like before the 18th century, before the 19th century, say. People were craftsmen. The skills were in the person. And then we did get interchangeable parts around the turn of the 19th century. So now you had interchangeable parts. People were building the same thing. They weren't one-offs. But you still had a lot of skill in the individual. You now had a little bit less necessary skill in the individual, and that they were trying to build the same thing. And the turn of the 20th century, you had this other paradigm created, basically, that fed the Industrial Revolution. Henry Ford basically pioneered this the notion of interchangeable people, as well as now interchangeable parts. And not that people were really interchangeable, but actually on the assembly line they somewhat were. The training at a Ford Motor Company often took 15 minutes. It's like, well, move this from here to here, keep your hand out of there, and you're okay. And part of the reason they did that is the work was so monotonous that even though they were paying way beyond normal standards wages, people would get just bored. They'd make a lot of money. They couldn't handle it anymore. They'd leave. So they needed to train people quickly. People were just machines, basically, to the Ford Motor Company at the turn of the 20th century. And so it was kind of like you had these two main paradigms up until recently. In other words, people could be craftsmen. In our software world, we kind of call those herding cats. I got all these people with their own opinion, or I can micromanage them and tell them what to do. Neither of these paradigms are very good, actually, because you need some sort of vision and control of the teams, control in the sense not controlling them directly, but making sure they're working on the right thing. On the other hand, you can't micromanage. Lean provides a different perspective, and Kanban is a manifestation of this at the team level. I can have engaged thinking people, but I can have management be there to coach and facilitate because they can understand the science of what's going on. They can see if people are actually paying attention to flow. So it enables management and teams working together, and this is a significant difference, and this is really useful. Kind of so like in software development, we have this business dealing with size, planning cycles, how much extra is needed in projects. These are important things. In other words, how much do I build? How many projects am I giving to my team? If you've been in an organization where the teams are overwhelmed with a number of enhancements or escalations they have to deal with, you've seen that their productivity has gone down. Trying to make them better doesn't necessarily help because the problem might be at the business end with how many projects there are. Okay, management kind of ties these two together, but if business isn't doing their job, management can't do their job very well. Team agility is how is the team able to do their process well? Are they doing things well? Technical agility, or team technical we sometimes call it, is how complex is the code, what's the quality. So in our mind, business agility is actually, the business end rather, is about selecting the right work. Team agility is using the right process at the team level. Technical agility is using the right practices so you've got high quality, and management kind of glues it all together. Okay. So there are different places to start. Is the team my problem? Business the problem? Do I have right product portfolio management as my technical practices? You don't really always want to start at the team. And one advantage we've seen of Kanban and Scrumban is because it's about a flow-based thing, if you have to start, though, somewhere like at the team, you can put it in and you don't have to change the team structure. I had that in the table, but I didn't talk about it too much. Scrum kind of requires you, and XP requires you to create teams. Kanban can be overfit onto the existing way you're doing work. And in fact, the seminar I did last night, we recorded it. It'll be available in another week or so, which talks about how to start with Kanban, and a lot of that conversation was about how you can kind of dial up the transition level. So this is actually something that comes from Ken Schwaber, and there's the URL so you can see I'm not making it up. Ken is the iconic leader of the Scrum community, and he says he suspects that only 75%, or rather 75%, don't get the benefits they want, that 25% succeed with Scrum. And they allude to the fact that they're not really solving their impediments, and it takes a lot of discipline and things like that. But personally, I'm not sure it's a coincidence. I think it may be because Scrum is team-centric and you have other issues. Okay. So I know that's been a whirlwind. I tend to always jam too much in. Well, I'm not sure I'm going to apologize for it. At least I threw a lot of stuff out at you. We've got 5 minutes for Q&A. While we're doing this, I'm going to show you a couple other slides just for reference. So I'm going to take the questions off here. I'm going to start with in a minute. But let me show you a couple of other slides. If you like this and you want to get more information, our approach at Net Objectives is something we call business-driven software development. It's coming from the business side, how to do product portfolio management. We've already started this, as you can see. The first 2 sessions one's already available as a webinar. That'll be coming offline soon. The other ones will be available in the next few days. And the next session is March 29th. We do one every 3, 4, 5 weeks. You go to our website, click free or low-cost seminars, and you'll see more information on this. So that's one place to go. And the other thing I want to show you is we want to ask what other seminars you want. So while I'm answering questions, why don't you be looking at this list, decide kind of what seminars you want, send emails to me or Donna on this, and then we're going to compile things. These are seminars I can do, or Donna, I guess, will look to see some other people if that's more appropriate. But I love doing webinars, so I might, if you like me, tell her that. If you didn't like me, tell her that too. and then she'll make those decisions. Okay, now while you're doing that, I'm going to be answering questions. So there was a question about globally distributed teams, like is there a best way? And that's too detailed to go into here. That'd be a good one for a user group. And I realize we've started there are several user groups out there, and you could use the ones on the PMI. And I actually think I even talked about an open user group on the PMI's community of practice, one we call Lean-Agile. But we also have another user group that's kind of for net objectives, so we can talk about very focused what we do. So I'll make sure you get that information about what user groups to follow up with. The question, would you say there are other industries apart from IT and R&D benefit from agile methods? And I would say absolutely, particularly Lean. I mean, software is like one of the last industries Lean has come to. It's been in service organizations, has shown a lot of improvement. It's been in the construction industry with a lot of improvement. So it definitely is applicable to lots of different things. Okay, with a clear interface, an offshore group that's 8 time zones away works well. Complete test, build in time zone A, then go home. Next day, results of a test cycle from time. Yes, that's right. That sometimes you can really do well by kind of looking at almost like shift work, but you have to make sure that you can give them something that they do, that they don't need to come back with questions, and acceptance tests given to them in a way like that can be very, very good. Okay. Yeah, great. Okay. Most of these now thanks and things, which is great. Okay, I'm just looking. Oh, in terms of voting for these things, well, I guess Donna can copy these. We're also looking for email stuff. Let's see. How do Kanban and Scrum teams effectively work in supporting production software, escalations, hot fixes, et cetera? No, that's a really good question. And it does show some of the difference between the two. In Scrum, since you're committing to what you're going to do on the next 2 weeks, escalations represent an interruption. And what we recommend people do then is you kind of historically look at how many interruptions you get and don't schedule 100% of your time. If you know you're going to get a few, you got to leave some time open for it. In Kanban, you have a different way of doing it. You can actually have what's called service level agreements. And you could say, well, this is what I'm going to normally work on, but if I get an escalation, you can tell me if I need to just kind of bump it to the top of the queues, but I'm going to work in my normal way. Or you can say, well, I'm going to drop what I'm working on and work on this. So now that'll slow you down, but at least the team knows, or their management knows what's going to happen. So both have to deal with service interruptions like that, and both can, but they do it a little bit different way. Let's see. Okay, well, I guess I'm getting more now comments on what people want, which is great. Keep that up. But since we're running to the end of the time zone here, I got one last slide to show you, which is if you want to learn how to get a PDU for this, there's all the info you need. We are a rep, and I will actually say one thing I'd be interested in, and you should send this as an email to me. One thing we've been considering doing is starting. We've offered these through SQE at times, what we call a Lean-Agile project management course, which is how to be a project manager in a lean perspective. So it actually deals with Kanban, Scrum, and Scrumban, because you can do Scrum with this lean mindset. Of course, you do that a lot. You're more like Scrumban. But if you're interested, just shoot me an email, because we're considering setting up a few of those as public courses around the country, and because we're kind of scattered around the country. And I'd be interested if people are interested. I could set them up basically where there's some interest already. So please do that, and thank you for being here, and I'm going to hand this now back to Donna to do any wrap-up we need.
Thank you, Alan, so much. I know one of the big questions I get is, where do I go next? A lot of the people on the phone are very new to Agile. Where do you think they should go next? They want to know more about Kanban. Should they read a book? What do you suggest?
Well, there are a lot of seminars and webinars that are taking place all the time. Again, I would actually look at a resources page and scan through there. I would look at the user groups. If you're interested in Kanban in particular, there is one called the Kanban Dev on the Yahoo groups. If you're interested in Lean software, there's a Lean-Agile user group that I moderate called Lean-Agile under Yahoo groups. There's also, if you're more lean development, user groups are quite good. But you can lurk and listen and watch. Some of them are happy to go more for newbies, and some of them kind of are meant to be for people who are there more. The business-driven software development group that we've just started, I will send you an email about that, and that might be the safest place to go. But just know that that's really about how we do things. So you'll get more of a Kanban, Scrumban, Lean attitude with that. As far as books, there are quite a few, and in fact, on our website, you'll see a bibliography. And there's in the slide deck that'll be posted, there's some recommended reading at the end of it past these slides I've got here. So that'll be another place to look. If you're interested in Lean-Agile software development through the organization, I mean, I know I keep mentioning my book, but we wrote it to explain basically how to do that. If you want an introduction to Agile methods, it's kind of funny, even though I'm not all that fond of Scrum anymore, Ken Schwaber's first book on Scrum is actually a pretty good one as motivating why to do it. But if you look on our website, you'll see things like the business case for agility. Those are really good starting points because it's an hour and a half. You get a good idea of why Agile. So that would be a good place.
Thanks. I think that was great. That just seemed to come across to me in a couple places. You guys, you asked great questions. I know there's a million of them. I'll definitely follow up with an email on PDUs, the recording, user groups, how to get to all this stuff. So look for an email from me. Please wait. Give us till tomorrow to do that. It takes a little while to convert the video. So I think this was great. Thank you, Alan, so much. I think they all want you back. Will you come back?
Oh, good. I'd like to come back. So
all right.
That's great. And thanks for being here. And thank you, Donna, for setting this up.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, guys. We're going to wrap up.